at this time, were there any private applications of this, essentially this large machine? Were private actors allowed into the system? I mean, at what point and I know that as we move into the 70s and we start to have, personal computers, essentially early stage. I mean, I am old enough to know that in high school, the closest that we had to personal computers was basically a typewriter that had an extended monitor, was really, and then you could actually save some data. So I guess it was some computing, but
yeah.
But was there at that time any private entities that were in any way accessing this stuff or using it, or how did that sort of integration happen?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, that's a good question. I think look, almost immediately when ARPANET technology, this internet technology, was demonstrated and it began to connect these different research centers and military contractors around the country, and it began to be used to develop new kind of technologies and tools for the military. People who were involved in building this for ARPA, left and set up their own shop and set up their own networking companies that offered this to corporations, offered this technology to corporations. And corporations, large companies, took this technology and used it to connect internal networks and to use it to digitize their operations in this sort of primitive way. But I mean, I think the earliest stuff was really military, because that was the test bed, and I'd say the first deployment of this technology in America in the civilian world, or against the civilian population, I should say, what happened almost immediately. So in 1969, the ARPANET went online, and that year already, because there was a very active anti-war movement and a big movement to stop military research on campuses. Students at MIT and Harvard got their hands on a research proposal that talked about creating this Cambridge project, which talking about creating this data technology that could allow analysts to ingest data on people and movements and political movements. And they got their hands on the proposal, on the ARPA proposal, and in the text of it was very clearly a counterinsurgency weapon, a data-based counterinsurgency weapon that its planners wanted to deploy against third world countries where there were insurgent movements. And so back then the students held protests at MIT and against the ARPANET a month before it went online. And they warned that this is going to be used to surveil civilians, and that it was going to be deployed maybe overseas at first, but that it was going to come back very quickly and going to be used against civil rights activists and left-wing movements and progressive movements in general in America. And it was a huge protest. It was written up it was written up in the press at the time. It lasted for a month, and there was occupations of MIT of buildings on campus. So it was a pretty big thing, and of course these kids turned out to be right, because 1972, just 3 years after ARPANET went online, it was used to digitize surveillance files that were illegally collected by the Army on millions of anti-war protesters and civil rights activists in the 1960s. And the Army, actually Congress, forced the Army to destroy those files. But instead of destroying them, they actually digitized them and then used the ARPANET to essentially make them permanent, and then make them accessible to the White House, to the NSA, to the FBI, to the CIA, to the Pentagon. And so 3 years after the ARPANET went online, it was used to spy on Americans, almost immediately. And so the surveillance aspect of it and its domestic use was there from the beginning. Right?
And
was there from the beginning.
It just wasn't. It started as more of a repository and, I guess, a function of the data rather than the data collection that it has now become on some level, right? And let me ask you this: when we're talking about initially, and particularly in this stage, right before the model of the sort of I guess the dumb terminal and the central server is developed, how many people or how many agencies, are actually connected by this? Like, I mean, like,
Well, you're talking about, we're talking about what years now?
I don't know, like in the late '60s, when you're talking about this data that's fed in there, and is it just at like a couple of the top national security agencies, or are they at universities? MIT have a connection to that?
Yes.
So it's at some of the top universities, I guess, the technical universities, or, I mean, just how widespread was it at that point?
It's widespread, and it expands very quickly because, look, you have the major universities attached to it that are doing, and most of them are doing research on the ARPANET as part of the ARPANET program, and so they have connections to it. You have the Pentagon connections to it. You have an NSA connection to it starting in the early '70s. You have Air Force connection to it that was, I think, almost from the very beginning, and you have other connections to it which are basically unlisted. There are maps published, and there are discussions of it, of the different nodes and the expansion of the network. And the main thing is, look, the internet, the ARPANET, was created as a general purpose network that could connect to any kind of computer, right? And it could also connect to any other kind of network that was based on the same protocol. So you could take the ARPANET, right, and then you can connect it to a different network that ran on the same kind of design. And they could communicate, just like your local network, your local ISP can communicate with an ISP in China, right? Because they function on the same principle, and so they're interconnected. And so what happened, what started happening very quickly when the ARPANET design was shown to be very effective, was that the NSA and the Pentagon more broadly began to convert their internal networks to the ARPANET design, and so those networks were classified. Some of them were not classified, but they could connect to the actual ARPANET, and so they could communicate through the sort of unclassified ARPANET, which was a civilian network because it connected universities, right? And it wasn't a secret network,
right?
But they could communicate through that network. So two secret networks communicate with each other through the ARPANET, and so there were these other networks that began to be connected to it, and so which is exactly what kind of happens today. You have various portions of the internet or military networks that are secret and that civilians can't access them, but they are connected to the internet in at certain exchanges that are also secret, obviously. Okay. And so, look, the Pentagon began to adopt the internet as its default networking and telecommunications infrastructure, almost from the very beginning. And so, but as soon as it was proven to be effective, and so this is something that's been going on for 50 years.
All right. So I have sort of, I guess, a tangential question. Because this is relevant insofar as I think it undercuts the posing, I think, on some level of the libertarian, to the extent that there's a libertarian ethos in Silicon Valley, and I'm using Silicon Valley broadly speaking.
Of course.
I guess my question is to just sort of expose the sort of hypocrisy of this. Is that had the network protocols, the networking, the design been developed in the private industry, presumably there wouldn't be people who would spin off of it and then go and start up their own entities, right? I mean, it would have been, someone would have said, this is our technology and you need to do it through us, essentially, to be a part of this, right? I mean, we would have had it.
Yes.
And okay, so with that said, let's talk about how this technology does migrate to private corporations as we get better I guess, more advanced technology. And I should also just remind people that the point of this is because the structure from a very beginning defines the way the problems, or defines, I guess, the context in which we have problems with the internet today, right? I mean, this is the
Yes.
point. The DNA was laid there, and because it was used for these purposes, all of its use reflected from there sort of has this DNA in it. Is that a fair?
Yeah. Yeah. No. Look, that's a fair thing. Look, the internet was developed as a military project, right? To develop new kinds of to use computer technology and networking technology to create a management system for the military that could help them run operations in on a global scale, right? To create a kind of a radar system for the world, the way that you could see an aircraft moving across a radar screen, right? You presumably would want to have the same thing, but for your troops to understand what's going on, to understand all the conflicts in all the different places that America is involved in as an empire, to get a bird's eye view of the world, and that's what it was. That's what the idea was behind it, on a kind of a high level. Of course, the tools at the time did not allow that right away, but that was the driving force. And this technology was built by a military contractor. So right away you had a military design for this technology, or an intent, the reason why it was being funded as a Pentagon project, and then you had it actually being built by a military contractor. And so already there's this private-public aspect to it, right, from the very beginning, that plugs into the military-industrial complex, and that plugs into corporate America, and that plugs into empire management in the age of the Cold War. And so, yeah, it's there. And look, the internet was privatized starting in the late 80s, and it finished in the mid 90s. And that was there was a specific process that actually very few people know about. So the National Science Foundation was essentially tasked with bringing the ARPANET, right, this military network that was still attached to military research, to transfer it to the civilian sector. And the way that it did that, starting in the late 1980s, was to essentially, behind closed doors, without really any public debate, come up with a plan that would fund a national internet infrastructure, and then but design it in a way that as soon as it was commercially viable, that is, as soon as there were enough customers out there that could sustain a business model for internet service providers, the National Science Foundation, which is a federal agency, would privatize it. And so that's exactly what happened, beginning in the late 80s and concluding in, I think, 1995, when the National Science Foundation finally got out completely of the network. But the internet as the foundation of this civilian internet, right, was actually another government network called the NSF-Net, the National Science Foundation Network, that was completely funded by the federal government and privatized. And that was done explicitly. That was a plan. And I even, in my book, I even talked to a guy who privatized the internet. And I asked him, like, is it safe? Is it fair to call you the man who privatized the internet? And he told me, yeah, it's fair to say that. And we don't even know who this guy is. I mean, ask any American, do you know the name of the guy who privatized the internet? And you'll probably get a stare back at you like you're fucking insane. Like, what are you talking about? The internet was privatized. It was created by the brilliant guys in Silicon Valley who innovated it out of thin air. But that's exactly what happened. And so there was a couple of steps to it. It began as a military project. The technology was absorbed into operational military networks, and starting in the late 70s, became the foundation of military telecommunication systems. And as that was happening, the project was then handed over to a civilian agency, which funded a national network that connected all these universities and research institutions, and then privatized it. to companies that would later be absorbed by the giant telecommunication companies and become part of the ISPs that we all use today.
And this, I mean, this is the and just to sort of give a sense of what the alternate world could have been. I mean, we had a situation where you have these central servers, right, where these are the information repositories, and then we have these terminals that people access this information from afar, as opposed to a disaggregated system where everybody has computing power and there is no central terminal. And we now have that capacity on some level, but we're still sort of the genetic structure, I guess, of the way the internet was set up, where it was sort of terminal based and and it was centralized, still remains and is imprinted upon everything. And that is now where we have a situation where, I mean, it seems to me that was the genetic code that has led to the almost the concentration of power with entities like Google or with like Facebook or with the infrastructure itself, where I can't really communicate to anybody on the internet without the government having access via really 2 or 3 companies, essentially, right? I mean, it's not just that the government is eavesdropping; it's that there's such a concentration of entities through which I would communicate to other people, private entities, that the government just needs to go to 2 or 3 outlets and say, "Give us what you got."
Exactly. Yeah. Look, I mean, you're totally right. Look, there's a certain DNA in the way that it was the architecture of the network, which was these computers were expensive, and even the way that the network was structured, the routers that controlled the flow of traffic, these are pretty expensive computers. Obviously, not everyone could own one and have them in their bedroom, and that would be kind of ridiculous because it would be you didn't need that many of them. But the structure of the internet as we have it today is also partially because of the protocols and because of the original design, but also it's political, right? It's very political, and so there could have been a world in which in the late '80s, when the federal government began to create a civilian national infrastructure, where this wasn't handed over to a bunch of private companies and wasn't designed to be privatized, to be eventually privatized, but would be, handed over to the postal service or something, or handed over to municipalities, right? To some kind of democratic institution. And public institutions that could control chunks of the network and could oversee those chunks of the network and have power over them, right? And that maybe on a state level, right? I mean, there's a lot of different possibilities, but those things were not discussed because public ownership was not something that was going to be pursued in the Reagan years, right? Especially of a new telecommunications infrastructure that everybody back then knew was going to be a huge moneymaker. Everyone understood in the '80s that the internet, the NSF net, which was being privatized, that is the new profit center, and so this is not going to be given over to some kind of municipal agency, right? It wasn't going to be given to the post office, which Reagan was destroying, right, and gutting, and so at the time, right? So but there are possibilities where the original sort of corporate military structure of the internet could have morphed into something a bit more democratic, right? And but that didn't happen, obviously, because of politics and culture. So that's a very big part of the story of the internet. So it's not just that there was some kind of DNA in the internet, and then that it's immutable, right? You couldn't really change it anymore because that's just how it was. And so we almost have a fatalistic view of this. No, I mean, society created this technology, and it has the power to change it. It still does, but just the cultural forces and the political culture of the country, I mean, it was not going to push it in that direction at all, because how could you? All of political alignment was actually privatizing everything and pushing everything to the market sector and gutting public ownership of resources and gutting public oversight and democratic oversight of of the country, right? So so I think that's a big story that we don't really know about the internet, like basically alternative futures, maybe, you know,
Right.
of where this internet could have gone. And this is something that we need to think about, because I think, I mean, we shouldn't be fatalistic about this stuff.